Before the truth came back to San Francisco, before the polished boardroom fell silent, before one of the most powerful women in the Sterling family lost everything she had tried so hard to control, Elena Vance was standing on a narrow metal scaffold in a small coastal town in Oregon, painting the wall of a quiet cafe with trembling hands and a 7-month pregnancy hidden beneath an old gray coat. The wind coming off the ocean was cold enough to make her fingers stiff around the brush. Her back ached. Her ankles were swollen. Every breath felt heavier than the one before it. But Elena kept painting, because stopping meant losing the only money she had for rent, medicine, and the child she was carrying alone. No one in that town knew that she had once lived in a glass penthouse above San Francisco, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge. No one knew that her husband had been one of the most admired architects in California. No one knew that she had been thrown out in the rain by the very family that had once pretended to welcome her. And no one knew the cruelest part of all. The child inside her was the heir the Sterling family had demanded for 7 years. The child they had used to humiliate her for not giving them sooner. Yet when Elena discovered she was pregnant, she did not call them. She did not go back. She did not beg for protection. She ran, because by then she understood something that fear teaches faster than love ever can. Some families do not protect blood. They possess it. That morning, as Elena leaned forward to finish the pale gold edge of a painted sunrise on the cafe wall, a shadow fell across the pavement below her. She thought it was the owner coming to check on the mural. Then she heard a voice say her name. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one broken word carried up through the wind. Elena. The brush slipped from her hand. She looked down, and for a moment the whole world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Standing below the scaffold was a man so thin, so bruised by survival, so changed by pain that he looked almost like a ghost. His beard was rough, his coat hung from his shoulders. There were healing scars near his temple and across one hand. But Elena knew the shape of his face before she knew how to breathe again. Julian Sterling Vance, the husband she had mourned, the man San Francisco had declared dead, was standing in front of her. For months, Elena had lived with 2 griefs at once. One was the grief of losing him. The other was the grief of being betrayed by the people who should have carried her through that loss. Now both griefs stood before her in human form, and she did not know whether to climb down and hold him or scream at him for the nightmare she had survived without him. Julian looked up at her, and his eyes moved from her face to the swell beneath her coat. Whatever strength had carried him across miles, hospitals, airports, and lies seemed to leave him all at once. He gripped the rail beneath her scaffold as if the earth had opened under him. Elena was alive. Elena was carrying his child, and Elena had been alone. Long before that moment, long before the rain, the lies, and the return of a man everyone thought was gone. Julian and Elena had been 2 people with nothing but a rented room, a folding table, and one stubborn dream between them. When Julian first arrived in San Francisco as a young architecture intern, he was brilliant in the way unfinished things can be brilliant. His mind moved fast. His sketches had a strange, graceful confidence. He could look at a cracked warehouse, an empty lot, a forgotten corner of the city, and imagine a building that made people stop walking. But talent did not pay rent, and vision did not impress landlords. He lived in a cramped studio apartment where the heater failed in winter and the windows rattled whenever the wind came through the alley. During the day, he worked unpaid hours in firms that treated interns like furniture. At night, he delivered food until his hands smelled like rain cardboard and gasoline. Elena met him during one of those years when both of them were too tired to pretend they were doing fine. She was sitting near the ferry building with a small easel drawing portraits of tourists for $20 each. She had come to the city with her own quiet ambition. She loved art, But she had learned early that loving something did not mean the world would make room for it. So she drew faces under streetlights, smiled at strangers, and saved whatever money she could. Julian noticed her work before he noticed her face. She had a way of drawing eyes that made people look less posed and more known. The first time he stopped beside her easel, Elena assumed he wanted a portrait. Instead, he asked why she had softened the shadows under an old man's cheekbones. Elena told him that some lines told the truth, and others only made people look tired. Julian laughed, but he remembered that answer for years. Their love did not begin with grand gestures. It began with shared coffee when neither of them could afford dinner out. It began with Elena sitting on the studio floor while Julian spread blueprints across the bed because there was no desk large enough for his work. It began with two people falling asleep under coats because the heat had gone out again, then waking up early because rent was due and dreams did not excuse late payments. In those years, Elena saw Julian at his lowest. She saw him after firms rejected him. She saw him crumple a design he had spent 3 nights perfecting because a senior architect dismissed it in front of a room full of people. She saw him come home with wet shoes, red eyes, and the kind of silence that meant a person was one disappointment away from giving up. And every time, Elena did not offer empty encouragement. She sat beside him, studied the drawings, and asked questions that made him look again. One winter night, Julian was working on a proposal for a small cultural center that no one expected him to win. The design was beautiful, but cold. It had height symmetry and precision, but it lacked a reason for people to feel anything when they entered it. Elena watched him struggle for hours before she took a pencil and lightly traced a curve through the open central space. She suggested that the building should not just impress people from the street, it should draw them inward like a hand opening. Julian stared at the page for a long time. Then he began sketching over her line. That curve became the heart of the proposal. It transformed a rigid design into something alive. Months later, when Julian won the contract, critics praised the emotional intelligence of the space. They called him a rare young genius. They wrote about his instinct for light movement and human feeling. No one knew that the instinct they admired had been sharpened by a woman sitting barefoot in a freezing studio, drawing one soft line through the center of his ambition. That first contract changed everything. It brought attention. Attention brought clients. Clients brought money. And money brought the kind of rooms where people laughed too loudly at Julian's jokes because they wanted to be near the next famous name. He founded a small design company, and Elena helped him choose the name, polish the portfolio, answer early client messages, and arrange meetings in borrowed office space. She was not listed as a partner at first. She did not ask to be. She believed in him so completely that she confused his rise with their shared safety. As the company grew, Julian tried to bring Elena into the light with him. He credited her when he could. He told people she had an eye he trusted more than any consultant. He asked her to come to dinners, gallery openings, and investor events. But the higher he climbed, the more clearly Elena felt the difference between admiration and acceptance. People smiled at her, but their smiles often carried the same question. Where had she come from? What family was behind her? What did she bring besides loyalty and a gentle face? No one asked those questions more sharply than Julian's mother, Eleanor Sterling. Eleanor came from old money that had learned to survive by polishing cruelty until it looked like refinement. She was elegant, disciplined, and cold in a way people mistook for strength. Her family name mattered to her more than affection. She believed bloodlines were architecture too, something to be preserved, guarded, and displayed. In her mind, Julian's marriage had been a sentimental mistake, one she tolerated only because his career was growing too quickly for open opposition to be convenient. From the beginning, Eleanor treated Elena like a guest who had overstayed. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her cruelty was precise. At family dinners, she praised women who came from proper circles. At charity events, she introduced Elena without warmth, as if the word wife were a technical error she had not been able to correct. When relatives asked about children, Eleanor's expression would settle into a practiced sadness, the kind designed to make Elena look like the source of a private family tragedy. For 7 years, Elena and Julian tried to have a child. They endured doctors' calendars, tests, hope, disappointment, and the quiet heartbreak that returns every month with a familiar cruelty. Julian never blamed Elena, not once. He told her again and again that their marriage was not incomplete without a child, that she was not a failure, that love was not a factory, and her body was not a debt she owed his family. But Eleanor knew exactly where to press. At first, her remarks were wrapped in concern. She asked whether Elena was eating properly. She recommended specialists, with the faint implication that Elena had not tried hard enough. Then the comments sharpened. Eleanor began speaking of heirs, as if Julian were not a son, but an estate in need of management. She talked about the sterling future while looking past Elena's shoulder. She mentioned other women, women from old families, women with healthy children, women who understood duty. The worst moments happened in public, where Elena had to decide whether to defend herself and become the problem, or stay quiet and let the insult pass through her like a blade. Eleanor once smiled across a dinner table and said that some women enjoyed luxury without contributing anything lasting. Another time, at a holiday gathering, she remarked that a beautiful home felt empty without children, then let her eyes rest on Elena long enough for everyone to understand the target. Julian's younger sister Vivian often laughed softly at those moments, as if cruelty were a family language she had learned fluently. Elena endured more than she should have. Not because she was weak, not because she agreed. She endured it because she loved Julian, and because she knew what it cost him each time he stood between his mother and his wife. Eleanor had raised him alone after his father died. She had used that history like a chain, reminding him of sacrifice whenever he challenged her. Elena saw the conflict in him, the son who wanted peace, and the husband who refused to let peace be purchased with his wife's dignity. But Julian never left Elena alone in those rooms. When Eleanor crossed the line, he reached for Elena's hand. Sometimes he ended the dinner early. Sometimes he corrected his mother in a voice so calm it made the room colder. Once, after Eleanor implied that Elena had failed the family by not producing an heir, Julian stood and told every person at the table that Elena was not a machine built to continue a name. She was the soul of his life, and anyone who could not honor her had no right to sit with them. Elena loved him for that. She truly did. But even love defended in public can bleed in private. After those dinners, she would stand in the bathroom of their penthouse, hands gripping the sink, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The city glittered beyond the glass walls. The rooms were warm. The furniture was expensive. Everything around her said she had been given a perfect life. And yet, there were nights when she missed the old studio apartment, because at least there, the cold had been honest. Julian tried to reduce contact with his mother, but business made complete distance difficult. Eleanor still held influence through old family trusts and social circles. Her name opened certain doors, and she made sure Julian understood that. She attended company events. She introduced investors. She spoke of legacy in meetings where no one had invited her opinion. Julian's company had grown from a small studio into a respected design group handling luxury homes, private galleries, boutique hotels, and high-end retreats for people who wanted beauty to announce their power. Then came the Alaska project. It was supposed to be one of the defining designs of Julian's career, an eco-luxury retreat built near a remote mountain region where wealthy clients without isolation, without inconvenience. Julian had mixed feelings about it. He loved the landscape, but he wanted the design to respect it rather than conquer it. He insisted on going with the survey team before finalizing any concept. Elena worried about the distance, the weather, and the fragile connection in such remote terrain. Julian kissed her forehead before leaving and promised he would come back with sketches full of snow, stone, and light. The morning he left, Elena almost told him something. She had been feeling different for days, tired in a way that was not ordinary, sensitive to smells, strangely lightheaded. A small, impossible hope had begun moving through her, but after 7 years of disappointment, she was afraid to name it too soon. So she held the secret back, telling herself she would take a test while he was away. If it was negative, she would bear the sadness alone. If it was positive, she would tell him when he returned, and for once the news would belong to them before it belonged to anyone else. Julian never made it back on schedule. The first report was vague. Bad weather, delayed communication. A helicopter carrying Julian and part of the survey team had lost contact after a sudden geological event in the area. Then came words that made the body go cold before the mind understands them. Landslide. Impact zone. No signal. Search teams deployed. Elena spent the first night by the phone, still wearing the sweater she had worn to breakfast. She did not sleep. She barely moved. By the second day, the company's crisis team was calling every few hours. By the fourth day, hope had become something people lowered their voices around. By the seventh, officials told the families that survival was unlikely. They did not say impossible. That would have been too cruel. But everyone heard the meaning. San Francisco mourned Julian as if the city had lost a piece of its own skyline. Articles appeared with photographs of his buildings and solemn descriptions of his genius. Clients sent flowers. Architects posted tributes. People who had once ignored Elena at events now wrote messages about how strong she must be. The penthouse filled with arrangements that smelled too sweet, too alive, too wrong. Elena walked through them like a ghost, one hand often resting against her stomach, because by then she knew. She was pregnant. The test had turned positive 2 days after the helicopter disappeared. For a few hours, Elena held that tiny piece of truth alone in the bathroom, shaking so badly she had to sit on the floor. She laughed once, not from happiness exactly, but from the unbearable timing of it. The child they had prayed for had arrived at the very moment Julian was gone. She pressed both hands to her abdomen and whispered that the baby's father would come home. She said it because the child deserved to hear hope, even if hope was beginning to feel like a door closing in slow motion. Elena did not tell Eleanor immediately. She could not bear the thought of that woman turning her pregnancy into a family announcement, a legal claim, a performance of grief and triumph. She wanted to wait until there was certainty about Julian. She wanted one clean moment in a life that had become chaos. That hesitation saved her, because while Elena was drowning in grief, Eleanor was moving. Grief reveals character. In some people, it opens tenderness. In others, it removes the mask. Eleanor did not come to the penthouse to hold Elena. She came with Vivian, 2 attorneys Elena had never seen before, and a folder of documents. Her face carried the controlled sorrow of a woman already thinking past the funeral. She spoke of responsibility, stability, and the need to protect Julian's assets during an uncertain time. Elena, exhausted and hollowed out by fear, did not understand at first that she was being surrounded. Within days, Eleanor produced a power of attorney that supposedly gave her authority over major financial and corporate matters if Julian became incapacitated or missing. The document looked official. The signature looked like Julian's, if someone did not know the slight hesitation he made on the V in Vance. Elena noticed it immediately, but when she objected, Eleanor turned that objection against her. She suggested Elena was too emotional to understand legal necessities. Vivian added that the company could not be held hostage by a grieving wife with no business experience. The old assistant, who had worked closely with Julian Marisol, questioned the document as well. She knew Julian had been updating estate plans privately. She knew he had never trusted Eleanor with full control. Within 48 hours, Marisol was fired for alleged misconduct. Her company access was revoked. Her calls stopped reaching the executive office. Then Elena's cards stopped working. At first, she thought it was a bank error. She tried to buy groceries, and the transaction declined. She tried another card. Declined. She called the bank from the penthouse, only to be told the accounts were under review by authorized representatives. Her phone service disappeared the next morning. The car Julian had bought for her was removed from the building garage by a company driver who would not meet her eyes. She felt the walls of her life moving inward, quietly, efficiently, with Eleanor's fingerprints on every lock. The final blow came on a night of hard rain. Elena had been in Julian's study holding one of his old sketchbooks when the private elevator opened. Eleanor entered with Vivian and 2 security men. No one asked Elena to sit down. No one offered an explanation that respected her as Julian's wife. Eleanor simply told her that the penthouse belonged to family-controlled assets and that Elena no longer had the right to remain there. She said there were concerns about Elena's behavior, concerns about missing funds, concerns about loyalty. The words were vague enough to avoid proof and sharp enough to destroy dignity. Elena stared at her, unable to believe that even Eleanor could be this cruel. Julian had not been buried. His body had not even been found, and already his mother was erasing his wife from the home they had built together. Elena tried to reach for her phone before remembering it no longer worked. She asked for time. She asked to speak to a lawyer. She asked finally if Eleanor had any mercy at all. Eleanor looked at her with the same cold disappointment she had worn for 7 years and told her that because Elena had no child, she had no claim on the sterling future. Not one brick, not one share, not one room. In Eleanor's eyes, 7 years of marriage meant less than an unborn possibility Elena had not yet revealed. Something inside Elena went very still. She could have told them then. She could have placed a hand on her stomach and changed the entire room with one sentence. But as she looked at Eleanor's face, she saw the truth with terrifying clarity. If Eleanor knew about the baby, the cruelty would not stop. It would simply change shape. Elena would not be thrown away. She would be trapped, monitored, managed, perhaps even separated from her child by lawyers who could turn wealth into a weapon. So Elena said nothing. Security allowed her to take only a small bag. Into it she placed a few clothes, a worn sketchbook, a tin of charcoal pencils, and the small watercolor set she had kept since the studio days. She tried to take Julian's sketchbook, but Vivian pulled it from her hands, saying company materials had to remain with the estate. That casual theft hurt more than Elena expected. It felt as if they were taking not just property, but proof that she had existed beside him. Outside, the rain soaked through her coat within minutes. The building staff avoided her eyes. The city lights blurred across the pavement. Elena stood beneath the awning of the building where she had lived as Julian's wife, carrying their unborn child and a bag of art supplies, while behind her the elevator rose back into a world that had decided she was disposable. She did not go to friends in San Francisco. Eleanor would look there first. She did not go to the press. She had no documents, no working phone, no access to money, and no strength for a public battle while pregnant and grieving. She used the last cash in her wallet to buy a bus ticket north. She chose Oregon almost at random, guided by distant coastline and the memory of a small town she and Julian had once visited during a road trip years before. Wealth made their lives complicated. The town was called Bellwether Cove, a place of wet sidewalks, cedar trees, salt air, and shops that closed early in winter. Elena arrived before dawn with swollen eyes and no plan beyond survival. She found a room above an old laundromat owned by a widow named May Whitcomb, who accepted cash for the first week and did not ask too many questions. May noticed the expensive coat, the exhausted face, and the way Elena flinched whenever a phone rang in the shop below. But she had lived long enough to know that some people arrive carrying stories they cannot tell yet. Elena began looking for work the same day. At first, she drew portraits at the harbor, just as she had done years before in San Francisco. Tourists were fewer in the cold season, but sometimes fishermen paid her to draw old boats before they were repaired, or shop owners asked for chalkboard menus with decorative lettering. Then, a cafe owner saw a small sketch Elena had made of the coastline and asked whether she could paint a mural on a back wall that had been stained by years of damp weather. Elena said yes before she knew whether her body could endure it. That first mural paid enough for rent, prenatal vitamins, and a used phone she registered under her maiden name. After that came another wall, then a bookstore corner, then a seafood restaurant that wanted waves painted along the hallway. Elena worked slowly, carefully, often with one hand pressed to her back. She learned which ladders felt stable and which owners would let her take breaks without making her feel ashamed. She learned to eat even when grief stole her appetite, because the baby needed more than sorrow. She learned how to wake from dreams of Julian calling her name and remind herself that mourning still required courage. Her pregnancy was not easy. The local clinic doctor noticed quickly that Elena was measuring larger than expected. More appointments followed, more concern, more warnings about rest, nutrition, and stress. Elena listened politely, then returned to work because advice did not pay bills. She did not tell the doctor much about her past. She said her husband had died in an accident. She said his family was not involved. The doctor's face softened at that, but Elena looked away. Pity was almost harder to bear than hunger. There were nights when she sat on the floor of the rented room, sorting receipts and counting bills, and felt anger rise so hot it frightened her. Not just at Eleanor, at herself. She wondered why she had stayed silent for so many years. She wondered why she had protected Julian from the full weight of his mother's cruelty. She wondered whether love had made her patient or merely trained her to shrink. Then the baby would move a firm little pressure from within, and Elena would place both hands over that movement, like a promise. She began speaking to the child in the evenings. She told stories about Julian, but not the public ones, not the awards, the buildings, the magazine covers. She told the child about the man who once used a broken umbrella to cover her easel during a rainstorm while he got soaked himself. She told the child about the night he burned soup because he was too busy listening to her describe a painting she wanted to make someday. She told the child that their father had loved deeply, laughed badly when tired, and believed light could change the way a person felt inside a room. But she did not pretend everything was simple. Sometimes she told the child that love was real and still not enough unless it had courage beside it. She promised that no matter what happened, this baby would never be treated like a key to money, a title, or a family name. This baby would be wanted for being alive. While Elena was building survival, one painted wall at a time, Julian was learning how difficult it could be to return from the dead. The helicopter had not exploded the way early reports suggested. It had been forced down after the landslide altered the terrain and sent debris across the route. The crash was brutal. 2 people died before help arrived. Julian survived with a head injury, broken ribs, a damaged leg, and long periods of confusion that stole hours and sometimes days from his memory. The first people to reach the wreckage were local responders working with indigenous search volunteers who knew the mountain routes better than any outside team. They got him out alive, but alive was not the same as safe. For weeks, Julian moved in and out of awareness in a remote medical facility, then a larger hospital, once weather-allowed transfer. His identification had been damaged, communications were delayed and confused, records were incomplete. By the time someone connected his identity to the missing architect from San Francisco, Eleanor had already influenced the public narrative at home, and Julian was still too injured to understand the scope of what had happened. Even when he became lucid, recovery was slow. He woke many mornings with Elena's name in his mouth before he remembered where he was. Nurses told him he had been asking for her. He tried to call, but the first numbers failed. The penthouse line routed through staff who said she was unavailable. His own phone was gone. His company contacts had changed. He was told through carefully filtered messages that his mother was handling everything until he could travel. That should have reassured him. Instead, it made him uneasy. Pain sharpens some memories and blurs others. Julian could forget the date, forget the order of surgeries, forget what he had eaten that morning, but he did not forget Elena. He did not forget the way she held a pencil between her fingers. He did not forget how she looked at him when he was lying to himself. He did not forget the woman who had chosen poverty with him when there was no guarantee of anything better. So when vague messages suggested Elena was not well or difficult to reach, something in him refused to settle. Months passed before Julian could travel. When he finally returned to San Francisco, he did not return triumphantly. He arrived thin, walking with a cane, face marked by injury, carrying a duffel bag from the hospital, and a fury he did not yet understand. The city that had mourned him greeted him like a miracle. The company lobby filled with gasps, tears, and stunned silence. Employees whispered his name, as if saying it too loudly might make him disappear again. Eleanor was waiting in his office. She embraced him with perfect tears. Vivian cried beside her. They told him how unbearable it had been, how much they had suffered, how hard they had worked to protect what was his. Julian listened, but his eyes searched the room for the only person he needed to see. Elena was not there. Her photographs had been removed from his shelves. The small ceramic cup she used for paintbrushes was gone from the corner of his desk. Even the chair she preferred near the window had been replaced. When Julian asked where his wife was, Eleanor lowered her eyes. The story she told had been prepared carefully. She said grief had changed Elena. She said Elena had panicked after the accident, become unstable, withdrawn money, copied proprietary design files, and disappeared. Vivian added that there had been rumors of another man. Eleanor produced emails, bank notices, and documents that seemed to show unauthorized transfers. She showed him a signed statement from a security contractor claiming Elena had removed confidential materials from the penthouse. She spoke gently, as if protecting Julian from pain, but every word was designed to bury Elena deeper. Julian did not interrupt. His face remained still. Eleanor mistook that stillness for belief, but Julian knew silence. He had lived with architects, investors, lawyers, and powerful clients long enough to recognize when a room had been staged. The evidence looked too neat. The grief looked too useful. And more than anything, the story asked him to believe that Elena had become the opposite of herself at the exact moment he was unable to defend her. He asked one question. Why had Elena not been there when he returned? Eleanor said Elena had made her choice. Julian looked at his mother, then really looked at her, and saw something he had spent years refusing to fully name. Not grief, not fear. Possession. Eleanor was not relieved that he had survived because her son was alive. She was relieved because control could continue. That night, Julian did not sleep in the penthouse. He went there only long enough to see what had been removed. Elena's clothes were gone, but not carefully. Her art books had vanished. Her old easel was missing. The framed photo from their first office had been taken down. In the bathroom cabinet, he found one thing left behind, wedged behind a drawer, as if overlooked in haste, a small paper wrapper from a pregnancy test. He stood holding it beneath the bathroom light, and the air seemed to leave the room. It was not proof. It could have been old. It could have belonged to someone else, though he knew that was unlikely. But in his mind it connected to 100 memories at once. Elena's tiredness before he left, the hesitation in her face that morning, the way she had almost spoken, then smiled instead. Julian gripped the sink until his injured ribs screamed. If Elena had been pregnant when Eleanor threw her out, then this was not only betrayal, it was danger. Julian began investigating quietly. He did not confront Eleanor immediately. A public accusation without proof would give her time to destroy whatever remained. Instead, he became the calm son, recovering from trauma, the grateful founder returning to work, slowly, the man too injured to challenge the people who had protected him. Eleanor relaxed around that version of him. Vivian became careless, and Julian started pulling threads. The first thread was Marisol. It took him several days to find her because Eleanor had made sure her departure looked shameful. Marisol met Julian in a quiet diner outside the city, and when she saw him walk in with a cane, she cried before she could speak. Then she told him everything she knew. She told him the power of attorney had appeared too quickly. She told him Julian had never filed such a document with the legal team she knew. She told him Elena had called the office repeatedly after the accounts were frozen, frightened and confused, and that those calls had been redirected. She told him she had been fired after questioning why Elena was being locked out. The second thread was the building staff. Some were afraid to talk. Eleanor had influence, and staff in luxury buildings learned quickly that truth can cost employment. But one night, Doorman, a man Julian had always treated with respect, finally admitted that Elena had been forced out during the rain with only a small bag. He had wanted to help her, but security had been instructed that she was no longer authorized to enter. He remembered her face. He remembered her asking for a taxi and then walking away when none came quickly enough. He remembered thinking she looked ill. The third thread was the money. Julian hired a private forensic accountant through a lawyer Eleanor did not know. The accountant discovered irregular transfers, temporary account freezes, and administrative changes made under the authority of the questionable document. The accounts had not been drained by Elena. They had been controlled by Eleanor and Vivian, with funds moved through consulting entities that had no legitimate connection to the company. Some transactions were disguised as emergency stabilization expenses. Others were simply theft, wearing a tailored suit. The fourth thread was the signature. Julian had signed thousands of drawings, contracts, letters, and personal notes. His signature had evolved over time, but certain movements were unconscious. The forged power of attorney copied the shape, but not the rhythm. A handwriting expert confirmed what Julian already knew. The document was not authentic. Still, none of that told him where Elena had gone. Finding her required a different kind of search. Julian asked the private investigator to look for travel medical records where legally accessible art commissions, old contacts, and any trace of Elena's maiden name. Weeks passed. Each day without news felt like punishment. Julian imagined her in cities, shelters, hospitals, rooms he could not see. He imagined her pregnant and afraid, hating him, believing he had died, or worse, believing he had somehow allowed his family to do this. Then, one afternoon, the investigator found a photograph posted by a small bookstore in Bellwether Cove. It showed a newly painted reading nook, all soft blues and golds, with an artist's signature tucked near the lower corner, E. Hart, Elena's maiden name. Julian opened the image and knew before anyone confirmed it. The line work was hers. The light was hers. Even after everything, Elena still painted hope into corners where other people saw blank walls. He left for Oregon that night. The drive north gave him too much time to think. San Francisco's glass towers faded behind him. Rain moved across the windshield. His injured leg throbbed, and still he refused to stop longer than necessary. He thought of every dinner where Elena had lowered her eyes while Eleanor attacked her. He thought of every time Elena had said she was fine because she did not want to make the conflict harder. He thought of himself standing beside her, defending her in moments, but failing to understand the larger war being waged against her. He had loved Elena. He had chosen her. But had he protected her enough before the disaster made protection impossible? By the time he reached Bellwether Cove, morning had broken gray over the water. The town was waking slowly. A delivery truck idled near the bakery. A woman swept rainwater from a shop entrance. Julian went first to the bookstore, then to the cafe, whose owner had recently posted about a mural in progress. He did not call ahead. He did not know what he would say. There were apologies too large for language, and wounds too deep for surprise reunions. Then he saw her. Elena stood high on a scaffold, painting sunlight onto a wall, while the real sky above her remained heavy with clouds. Her hair was tied back carelessly. Her coat was worn at the cuffs. She looked thinner in the face, older in the eyes, and more beautiful to him than the memory that had kept him alive. Then the wind moved her coat, and he saw the curve of her pregnancy. For a few seconds, Julian could not move. The world narrowed to the woman on the scaffold and the life she had been carrying without him. His child. Their child. The miracle they had stopped daring to expect. And with that realization came another, darker one. Eleanor had seen Elena as worthless because she believed Elena had no child. But Elena had walked into the rain with the very future Eleanor claimed to worship, and Eleanor had not known because cruelty had blinded her before ignorance ever could. Julian said Elena's name. She looked down. The brush fell. People later imagined that such a reunion must have been dramatic, filled with cries, embraces, and instant forgiveness. But real pain does not always move that way. Elena climbed down slowly, one careful step at a time, while Julian stood below with tears already on his face. When her feet reached the pavement, she did not run to him. She stared at him as if her heart and her mind were fighting over whether he was real. Julian tried to speak, but the first words broke apart. He told her he was alive. He told her he had been injured, cut off, delayed. He told her he had only just learned what his mother had done. He told her he had looked for her as soon as he understood. The sentences came unevenly, each one carrying truth, but not enough repair. Elena listened without moving. Then she asked him whether he had known. Julian said no, and the word came out like a vow. He had not known she was thrown out. He had not known her accounts were frozen. He had not known she was pregnant. He had not known his mother had built a lie around her absence. He said all of this with the desperation of a man trying to cross a bridge that had burned months before. Elena's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. She told him that not knowing did not erase what had happened. She had been humiliated for years in rooms where everyone waited to see whether he would stop it. He had stopped individual insults, yes. He had held her hand, yes. He had loved her, yes. But Eleanor had remained close enough to destroy them because Julian had kept trying to manage poison instead of removing it. The words hurt because they were true. Julian lowered himself carefully to his knees despite the pain in his leg. It was not a performance. There were no cameras, no family witnesses, no board members watching. Just the wet pavement, the smell of coffee from the cafe, and Elena standing before him with every reason not to trust what love promised now. Julian asked permission before reaching toward her. When Elena did not step back, he placed one shaking hand gently against the curve of her belly. The baby moved. Julian bowed his head and cried in a way Elena had never seen before. Not the controlled tears of grief, not the quiet sadness of disappointment. This was a breaking open. He apologized for not coming back sooner, though both of them knew survival had not obeyed his wishes. He apologized for leaving her in a world where his name had protected buildings better than it protected his wife. He apologized because the person who had hurt her most carried his blood, and that made the wound more complicated, not less. Elena wanted to collapse into him. Part of her did. Part of her remembered the studio apartment, the burned soup, the cold mornings, the man who believed in her eyes before the world believed in his buildings. But another part remembered rain on her face outside the penthouse, the dead phone in her pocket, the unborn child beneath her ribs, and the terrible knowledge that love without boundaries could become a doorway for cruelty. So she did not forgive him in that moment. She let him help her down from the scaffold. She let him walk beside her to May's building. She let him sit in the small rented room with the uneven floor and the second-hand crib she had bought from a neighbor. He looked at that room as if every object accused him. The folded baby clothes, the jars of coins, the sketchbook full of mural designs priced too low because Elena had been afraid of losing work, the prenatal vitamins lined beside a chipped mug. This was not poverty as a memory from their beginning. This was poverty inflicted by people who had used his absence as a weapon. May came upstairs with tea and studied Julian with open suspicion. Elena introduced him as her husband, and even that word seemed to surprise her. May did not soften quickly. She had watched Elena climb stairs after long workdays, watched her hide pain behind politeness, watched her eat toast for dinner so she could save money for medical bills. To May, Julian was not a miracle yet. He was the man whose world had swallowed Elena and spit her out. Julian accepted that suspicion. He did not defend himself to May. He did not ask Elena to come home immediately. He stayed in Bellwether Cove for several days, sleeping in a room at the small inn, visiting only when Elena allowed it. Each morning he brought groceries and left them without making a speech. He went to her doctor's appointments when she invited him, and when she did not, he waited outside. He learned about the pregnancy carefully, humbly, like someone being allowed back into a sacred room he had no right to enter loudly. At one appointment, Julian learned why Elena looked so exhausted and why the doctor had been worried about her size. The ultrasound showed not one child, but 3, 2 boys and a girl. Triplets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena had known for a little while, but saying it aloud with Julian beside her made the truth feel enormous again. 3 children. 3 lives arriving from the 7 years everyone had called emptiness. Julian laughed once through tears, then covered his mouth because the laugh was too close to a sob. Elena watched him and felt something inside her soften, not fully, not safely yet, but enough to hurt. The irony would have satisfied a crueler person. Eleanor had called Elena useless because there was no heir. Eleanor had thrown her away for having no claim, and all that time Elena had been carrying more of the sterling future than Eleanor's pride could ever deserve. But Elena did not want her children to be revenge. She did not want their lives reduced to a punishment for an old woman's arrogance. They were not proof of Elena's value. They were not a correction to Eleanor's insult. They were children, and that meant they belonged first to love. Julian understood that because Elena made him understand it. One evening, as rain moved softly against the windows, she told him that if he wanted to be part of their lives, he had to do more than rescue her after the worst had already happened. He had to tell the truth publicly. He had to cut off the power Eleanor had used to harm them. He had to stop confusing biological obligation with family loyalty. He had to choose not just Elena the wife, but Elena the mother. Elena the woman who had survived without him. Elena the person who would never again enter a room where she was expected to be grateful for being tolerated. Julian did not argue. He had argued with clients, boards, critics, contractors, city planners, and investors. He had built a career on defending designs. But there was nothing to defend here except the truth. And the truth was on Elena's side. When Elena finally agreed to return to San Francisco, she did so with conditions. She would not return to the penthouse as if nothing had happened. She would not meet Eleanor privately. She would not let the pregnancy become family property. She would not allow Julian's guilt to rush her healing. And if at any point he hesitated to protect her because the enemy was his mother, she would leave again without apology. Julian accepted every condition. They arrived in San Francisco quietly, not through the front entrance of the penthouse, but through the office of Julian's independent legal counsel. By then, the evidence had been organized with brutal clarity. The forged power of attorney, the bank freezes, the unauthorized transfers, the termination record for Marisol, security logs from the night Elena was removed, emails between Vivian and financial administrators, witness statements, handwriting analysis, a timeline that showed how quickly Eleanor had acted after Julian was presumed dead. Julian scheduled an emergency board meeting. Eleanor arrived confident. Vivian came with her, dressed in the polished armor of people who believe presentation can outshine evidence. They expected Julian to discuss restructuring after his recovery. They expected gratitude. They expected, perhaps, a quiet request to settle family misunderstandings. They did not expect Elena to enter the boardroom beside him. The room changed when she walked in. Some directors recognized her and looked ashamed. Others looked startled because the false story had done its work. They had believed she had fled. Elena did not lower her eyes this time. She wore a simple dark dress, her pregnancy impossible to hide her face, calm in a way that made Eleanor's composure flicker. Julian held the chair for her, then remained standing. He did not begin with anger. He began with dates. He laid out the official timeline of the accident, the period of his incapacitation, the communications he had not received, and the legal authority that had supposedly activated in his absence. Then his lawyer distributed copies of the handwriting report. The forged signature appeared on the large screen at the front of the room, beside verified signatures from Julian's records. The differences were subtle to anyone else, but once explained, they became impossible to unsee. Eleanor's face tightened. Julian then showed the account freezes the transfers and the internal approvals Vivian had signed. He showed the email removing Marisol after she questioned the document. He showed the security report from the penthouse and the later revision that tried to make Elena's removal sound voluntary. He played the building entry logs. He presented the statement from the doorman who had watched Elena leave in the rain. He did not insult his mother. He did not need to. The evidence did what rage could not. Vivian tried to interrupt first. She claimed emergency decisions had been necessary. She said Elena had been unstable. She suggested the pregnancy was suspicious, as if even now she could not resist turning life into accusation. That was the moment Julian's restraint finally sharpened. He told his sister in front of everyone that one more attempt to slander his wife or children would become part of the legal record. Children. The word moved through the room like a struck chord. Eleanor's eyes dropped to Elena's belly. For the first time in all the years Eleanor had known her, Eleanor looked not cruel, not proud, not elegantly disappointed, but frightened. Not because she loved the babies, not yet, maybe not ever in the way that mattered. She was frightened because the story she had built had turned against her. She had thrown away the very thing she claimed to value most, and now everyone in the room could see the emptiness beneath her obsession with blood. Julian continued. He announced that Eleanor and Vivian were removed from every advisory role connected to the company and family-controlled business interests under his authority. Their access to accounts was revoked. Their transactions would be referred for legal action. The company would cooperate fully with investigators. The family trust arrangements would be reviewed and separated from operational control. The Sterling mansion, maintained through funds Julian had provided for years, would no longer be available to them under his name. Eleanor finally spoke. She did not apologize. People like Eleanor often mistake consequences for cruelty when they are no longer the ones delivering them. She said Julian was humiliating his own mother. She said Elena had poisoned him. She said everything she had done was for the family. Her voice trembled at the edges, not with remorse, but with disbelief that power could leave her hands in public. Julian looked at her for a long moment. The room waited. He told her that family was not a word she could use after stripping his pregnant wife of shelter money and safety. He told her that blood did not excuse forgery, theft, or abuse. He told her that if she had wanted a legacy, she should have protected love when it was vulnerable, instead of attacking it when she thought no one could stop her. Elena did not speak during most of the meeting. She did not need to perform pain for people who had ignored it before. But near the end, when one director quietly apologized for believing the rumors, Elena nodded and said that belief, without courage, had helped the lie survive. It was not said loudly. It did not have to be. Several people in the room looked down because they understood. The public fallout was swift. The official statement from Vance Design Group was careful, legal, and restrained. It announced an internal investigation into forged documents and unauthorized financial activity during Julian's presumed death. It confirmed that Elena Vance had been the victim of false allegations and improper exclusion. It did not mention every cruelty. It did not need to. In circles where Eleanor had once moved like a queen, silence became its own verdict. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. People who had accepted her version of events began rewriting their memories, as people often do when power changes direction. Vivian tried to protect herself by blaming Eleanor. Eleanor tried to protect herself by claiming she had been misled by advisors. The advisors produced emails. The lawyers became busy. The same social world that had once admired Eleanor's icy certainty now watched her unravel under the weight of documents she could not charm, threaten, or dismiss. But for Elena, justice was not as simple as watching Eleanor fall. There is a kind of satisfaction in seeing truth exposed, but exposure does not erase nights spent afraid. It does not return the months of pregnancy when Elena climbed ladders because she had no choice. It does not remove the memory of rain, or the sound of a dead phone, or the shame of being treated like an intruder in her own home. Elena had to learn that vindication and healing are not the same thing. Julian wanted to fix everything quickly because guilt makes speed feel like devotion. He offered doctors, houses, lawyers, anything she needed. Elena accepted help where help was practical, but she refused to let him turn repair into a transaction. She did not need to be bought back into comfort. She needed to feel safe in ordinary moments. She needed to see him answer calls from his mother's attorneys without softening into old habits. She needed him to cancel meetings when she was too tired to stand, not because he was trying to prove something, but because their family mattered more than performance. She needed truth to become routine, so they did not move back into the penthouse. Julian sold it. That decision shocked people more than he expected. The penthouse had been a symbol of his success, a magazine-worthy space of glass, stone, and impossible views. But Elena could not enter it without feeling the elevator doors open on that rainy night. Julian understood. A home that remembers betrayal too clearly is not a home. It is a museum of damage. They rented a quiet house near the Presidio instead, with old wooden floors, fog in the mornings, and a small room Elena turned into a nursery. As the pregnancy advanced, Elena had to stop painting. Her body demanded rest with a seriousness she could no longer ignore. Julian attended birthing classes with the grave concentration of a man reviewing structural plans for a building that could not fail. He learned how to fold tiny clothes. He learned the difference between 3 kinds of bottle nipples. He learned that assembling 3 cribs could humble even a celebrated architect. Sometimes Elena watched him from the doorway, one hand on her belly, and felt the first cautious return of warmth. They still had difficult conversations. Some nights, anger rose unexpectedly. Elena would remember something Eleanor had said years earlier, something she had swallowed at the time, and the delayed pain would surface with new force. Julian listened. He did not ask when she would be over it. He did not remind her that he had exposed the truth. He learned that apology is not a single speech, but a discipline, a willingness to remain present when the person you hurt is still hurting. When the babies came, they came early, as triplets often do. The hospital room was filled with bright light, urgent voices, and the controlled intensity of doctors who knew every second mattered. Julian stayed beside Elena until they took her into surgery, and for the first time since his return, Elena reached for him without hesitation. It was not forgiveness fully completed. It was trust, choosing one moment because that moment needed both of them. The first cry was small but fierce, then another. Then another. 2 boys and a girl. Julian saw them before Elena did, tiny and fragile, each one wrapped in medical care and impossible grace. He cried again, but quietly this time, with a hand over his mouth as nurses moved around him. When Elena finally saw her children, something inside her that had been braced for months loosened. They were not heirs. They were not proof. They were not a prize the Sterling family had earned or lost. They were 3 breathing miracles, with wrinkled faces, dark wisps of hair, and the astonishing power to make every cruel word spoken over 7 years seem smaller than the sound of their cries. They named the boys Noah and Elias. They named the girl Leora because Elena wanted a name connected to light. The babies spent time in the neonatal unit, and those weeks became their own kind of test. Julian and Elena sat beside incubators, learned feeding schedules, celebrated grams gained, and discovered how slowly time moves when love is measured in monitors and tiny fingers. Julian missed meetings without apology. Elena sang softly when she had the strength. Sometimes in the blue quiet of hospital nights, Julian would look at Elena holding one baby against her chest and understand with painful clarity that this was the life his mother had almost destroyed. News of the triplets reached Eleanor, of course. At first, she sent flowers. Elena did not accept them. Then she sent a letter through her attorney, carefully worded, expressing sorrow for misunderstandings and asking for an opportunity to heal as a family. Julian read it once and placed it in a folder with the other documents. Misunderstanding was the word people used when they wanted the benefits of apology without the burden of confession. Later, Eleanor tried a different route. She wrote directly to Julian, reminding him of his childhood as father, the sacrifices she had made. She said she was an old woman who deserved to know her grandchildren. She said the children should not be punished for adult conflicts. Julian sat with that letter for a long time, not because he was tempted by it, but because grief for a living parent can be more complicated than grief for the dead. He had loved his mother once in the simple way children love before they understand character. He had spent years translating her control into concern because the truth was harder. Elena did not tell him what to do. That mattered. She had no interest in becoming the new keeper of his choices. She only asked him to remember that access to children was not a reward for blood, but a responsibility earned through safety, humility, and truth. Julian wrote back himself. He told Eleanor that the children would grow up surrounded by love, not greed disguised as legacy. They would not be held by someone who had endangered their mother and then called it family duty. If Eleanor ever wanted a place in their lives, it would begin not with flowers, lawyers, or emotional pressure, but with full accountability. Legal accountability, personal accountability, public accountability. Until then, the answer was no. Eleanor did not respond for months. By then, Julian had made another decision. He stepped away from the company he had built under the weight of the Vance and Sterling names. Not because he was defeated, and not because Eleanor had ruined it, but because he wanted to create something that belonged to truth from the beginning. The board resisted at first. Investors panicked. The press speculated. But Julian had spent enough of his life designing beautiful spaces for people who confused possession with meaning. He wanted a smaller life, with more honesty inside it. Elena slowly returned to art, not as a desperate means of survival this time, not on a scaffold while hiding from people who wanted to control her. She returned because creating had always been part of her, and because, for too long, she had placed her own gifts behind Julian's name. Together they opened a studio called Truth and Light. It was not a grand corporate headquarters. It was a warm, open design space with long tables, skylights, shelves of materials, and a corner where Elena could paint while the babies slept in a room nearby. The studio's first projects were modest compared with Julian's old luxury contracts: a community library renovation, a healing garden for a children's clinic, a small coastal inn that wanted to rebuild after storm damage. Spaces where beauty served people instead of impressing them. Elena's influence was visible everywhere: softer thresholds, warmer light murals that made blank walls feel remembered. Julian no longer allowed anyone to call him the sole genius behind their work. When interviewers tried, he corrected them, not sharply, simply. He said the best parts of his life and work had always had Elena's hand in them. Trust returned like dawn, not lightning. There were mornings when Elena woke before the babies and found Julian in the kitchen warming bottles with the focus of a man solving sacred mathematics. There were afternoons when he canceled calls because Noah had a fever or because Elena needed sleep. There were nights when the babies cried in a chorus so overwhelming that both parents stood in the hallway and laughed from exhaustion because crying would have taken too much energy. Ordinary life, with all its noise and mess, became the proof Elena had needed. Julian was not just sorry in dramatic moments, he was present in small ones. Eleanor's absence became part of that peace. People sometimes asked whether Elena felt cruel keeping a grandmother away from her grandchildren. The question usually came from those who had never been thrown into the rain by someone powerful enough to rewrite the story afterward. Elena did not answer harshly. She simply said that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not require her to hand her children to someone who had not learned how to love without ownership. Years later, when the triplets rolled enough to run through the studio with paint on their hands and questions in their mouths, Elena found herself telling them stories about the early days. Not the darkest parts, not yet. Children deserve truth in doses their hearts can carry. She told them about the tiny apartment where their parents had once dreamed on the floor. She told them about the fairy building the portraits, the first design contract, and the curve she had drawn that helped their father see a building differently. Julian listened from across the room, smiling with a tenderness that still carried regret, but no longer drowned in it. One afternoon, Leora asked why the studio was called Truth and Light. Elena looked at Julian, then at the windows where the late sun spread across the floor. She said, truth was what helped people find their way out of dark places, and light was what reminded them there was still something beautiful to build afterward. That answer stayed with Julian, because in the end, the Sterling mansion had been full of expensive rooms and empty love. The penthouse had been full of glittering views and unsafe memories. The boardroom had been full of powerful people who believed documents only when truth became impossible to ignore. But this studio, with its paint stains, toy blocks, unfinished sketches, sleeping children, and morning light, held something none of those places had ever truly held. It held peace. The story of Elena and Julian is not simply a story about a cruel mother-in-law or a wife falsely accused. It is about what happens when love is tested not by poverty, but by power. Poverty had tested them in the beginning, and they had survived it together. But power brought a different danger. It gave cruel people tools. It gave silence a polished surface. It allowed humiliation to sound like tradition and control to call itself family. Elena's strength was not in staying silent forever. Her strength was in surviving until she could speak without asking permission. She protected her children before anyone else even knew they existed. She walked away from wealth when wealth became a cage. She returned not as a woman begging to be believed, but as a woman whose truth could stand on its own. Julian's love was real, but real love still had to grow up. He had defended Elena from insults, but eventually he had to confront the system that allowed those insults to keep returning. He had to learn that loyalty to a parent cannot come at the cost of abandoning a spouse to emotional violence. He had to understand that family is not proven by shared blood, but by the courage to protect what is vulnerable when protection costs something. And Eleanor, who worshipped legacy more than love, became the clearest warning of all. She wanted heirs, but despised the woman who carried them. She wanted control, but lost connection. She wanted the sterling name to continue, but never understood that a name without kindness is only a label attached to fear. So when Elena stood, years later, at the entrance of Truth and Light Studio, holding Leora on her hip while Noah and Elias tugged Julian toward the door, there was no mansion behind them, no cold family portrait, no inheritance heavy with conditions. There was only a home they had built from what survived the wreckage: love, truth, boundaries, and the courage to begin again. And maybe that is the question this story leaves behind. If you were Elena, after everything Eleanor had done, would you ever allow her to meet the grandchildren she once unknowingly threw into the rain? Share your thoughts below. And if you want more emotional stories about love, betrayal, survival, and justice arriving when the truth finally finds its voice, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next one.